Welcome to Talking Live. I'm Dr. Robi Ludwig, and we have a slightly different kind of show today. We have author and professor at Wharton, Dr. Mauro Guillen. He is an award-winning professor at Penn, where I also went, but he's a sociologist and a political economist. This is a book that he wrote I can't recommend strongly enough. It's not the type of book I usually read. I'm usually self-help, psychology, but this is a winner. It's called 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. Dr. Guillen, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Dr. Robi, for having me. It's a pleasure.
I have to say, I got your book from your publicist, and I bought it anyway on Kindle because I want to have it with me. You write in such a way that a layperson can really understand very complex issues. What motivated you to write this book?
Well, you see, I started doing the research for this about 7 years ago because I was making presentations to all sorts of different audiences, from high school students all the way to business executives, about what's going on in the world, what's changing, right? And I was joking with them that I thought the world will come to an end pretty soon, the world as we knew it. And I decided, given the reaction from the audiences, that they were craving for analysis as to what's going on in the world with everything, with babies, with women, with businesses, with the middle class, and so on and so forth. So I decided about a couple of years ago, let's write the book. And here we go.
And here we are. And it's very powerful. And as you mentioned, you said the world you're about to know is about to come to an end. Are you prepared? That sounds quite ominous and scary.
Well, I think it's scary if you don't prepare for it. I think the most important thing to realize right now is that even before the pandemic struck, we were under the effects of so many, huge trends that were changing our lives, right? Mm-hmm. So, e-commerce was already going on before this pandemic. The trend towards remote work was already going on before this pandemic. The rise of women as well holders and as college students and so on and so forth was already going on. So we all need to adjust. The pandemic has merely, I think, accelerated all of those trends. And so the future is arriving faster than we thought.
What is it about the pandemic that made everything more intensified and more extreme?
Well, let me give you 2 or 3 examples, brief examples from different walks of life. So first, the pandemic accelerates population aging for a very simple reason. We're having fewer babies. People are postponing making that big decision as a result of the pandemic. And therefore,
people are having less sex.
Absolutely. And every survey indicates that. And by the way, the biggest contributor to that is technology. We're getting distracted by technology, right? I mean, there's, as you know, extremely good evidence to the effect that all of these gadgets essentially distract us from, procreation, right? Another example is the rise of emerging markets, right? And the middle classes in those markets. So this pandemic is affecting them less so than it is affecting us here in Europe and in the United States. And therefore, I think that future in which emerging markets are going to be dominant is also arriving faster. So I could go on and on with many examples, but essentially the key message here is that the future is right around the corner, and it is happening, or is going to become a reality much faster than we thought.
Who do you think wants to be more aware of this future change? And who's more likely to be in denial about it?
Well, I think, unfortunately, we have an educational divide in this country, which, as you know, is shaping the presidential election, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, unfortunately, I believe that people with more education seem to be more keenly aware that things are changing. But more importantly, they know how to adjust, or they have ways of adapting to this new situation. And to tell you the truth, I mean, we're both highly educated. I think we should avoid making the mistake that we made over the last 20 years of essentially neglecting that part of the population. I mean, we need to embrace them, and we need to help them navigate all of these changes, because no matter who gets elected in November, no matter who gets to say what the United States as a country does, I think we're all on the same boat in the sense that we're going to have to deal with this new brave world that is emerging right before our eyes.
You mentioned two companies. One was during an interview where you said Spotify really had the right idea, that they were able to shift in a creative way that kept them relevant. And in your book, you mentioned a company that was not able to do that, Kodak, that refused to look into the future, focused on the now, and as a result, they went bankrupt.
Absolutely. So every company needs to adapt to these changing circumstances. And as you just mentioned, very few of them actually managed to succeed at that. Kodak just completely neglected the digital revolution. Spotify, in the midst of this pandemic, decided, let's get into podcasts. So we cannot produce our own songs. That's too expensive, right? Mm-hmm. But let's get into podcasts. And as you know, Michelle Obama have signed up with them. And they have produced already over, I believe, 120,000 of these podcasts. So I think, pivoting, I think reinventing at least part of what you're doing in the midst of a pandemic such as this is extremely important.
So I did not know this, and I never quite thought of trends in this way. I actually thought of kind of globalists controlling these trends. But you say trends really are based on our individual decisions. And one of those decisions is how many children we choose to have.
Absolutely. So the first chapter in the book is called Follow the Babies. So for me, that phrase, it's actually a methodology. So my approach is the following. If somebody wants to know what the world is going to look like in 5 or 10 years from now, follow the babies. See who are the young people today, because they're going to be the most important consumers, decision makers, and so on and so forth in 10 years from now. And so in the book, I spend quite a bit of time trying to understand exactly why, I should say, women are having more babies or fewer babies as time goes by. And by the way, that's another sense in which women are becoming more important, because you are the ones who are having the babies or not having them. And that will fundamentally reshape those decisions, individual decisions, will fundamentally reshape the world.
So you say Asia is where the babies are being born, and Africa, and companies will have to consider that, what the Asian market wants in order to be relevant. Absolutely.
And let me give you an example. Walmart. Everybody's talking about Walmart because they have joined Microsoft to take over TikTok, right? Announced that last week. Well, Walmart has stores in more African countries than European countries. They have more stores in Africa than in several Latin American countries. They're betting on Africa. Why? Because between now and the year 2030, 400 million babies are going to be born in Africa. And the beginnings of a middle class are right now for everyone to see. So Africa is going to be a very important part of the world in the near future.
In television, and you do a lot of TV and radio, a lot of media, there's always this tendency to focus on 25 to 55 because that's considered the market that buys the most. There's a lot of focus on millennials, but you say, and I was very comforted to hear this, that really companies need to consider the graying of America and really think out of the box when it comes to advertising.
Absolutely. I call it gray is the new black. And look, the trend is very simple. For the first time in history, the population above the age of 60 in the United States is going to be the largest consumer group. Here in the United States, 80%, listen to this, 80% of the net worth is owned by people above the age of 60.
That's
I'm
huge.
not trying to convey here the idea that everybody in that age group is well off. Of course not. There's a lot of inequality. But it's going to become, not just politically, which already is, but also economically, it's going to become, I think, the single most important customer group in the marketplace.
I remember when I wrote my book, Your Best Age Is Now, I interviewed Jean Chatzky, who focuses and gives money advice. And she was saying that really the Asian market really figured it out. I think it was the Korean market where they took older Koreans and educated them so that they could be a part of the workplace. And of course, that really hasn't happened here in the United States. Do you see that happening? Are we ever going to retire? Is that a thing of the past?
Well, look, I think we need to keep in mind that we're living longer and longer and longer, and
Yeah.
especially you women. And this is extremely important. So a 65 or 70-year-old today is not the same as a 70-year-old 20 years ago. And this is going to continue changing. We're in much better shape psychologically and
Yes.
also physically. And so it doesn't make any sense to retire at age 63 or 64. You see, when pension systems were invented more than a century ago, life expectancy was 35. I mean, those
Yeah.
politicians were geniuses, right? It's like, we're going to promise people retirement at age 63, knowing that most of them won't even reach that age. But now the
Yeah.
situation is completely different. And
Yeah.
also, I think people are realizing that retirement is oversold, that you get lonely, you get bored after a while.
Yeah.
What I think is going to be the winner, Robbie, I think is hybrid, jobs.
Yeah.
So you don't work every day of the week, because people above the age of 60, 70, they also want to have leisure time.
Right.
So I think the gig economy, I think remote work, they're going to be really helpful to that demographic, because they're going to find new formulas, new ways of essentially continuing work without having to commute to the office every day of the week.
There was one study that found the happiest women, I'm sure this is true for men too, the happiest women and mothers were those who could work part-time, that could navigate their schedule in a way that worked for themselves. And I think we're seeing that that's really true for everyone.
No, absolutely. I think, we've inherited from a previous time in history this idea that life progresses in stages. First, that you go to school, then you work, and then you retire. And I think the boundaries are being blurred now. And for starters, I think we need to continue being schooled or educated throughout our lifetimes, because things are changing so fast. And then the other thing, as you point out, is let's work more on a part-time basis. Why not? But in exchange, let's stretch the number of years that we're actually actively working.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right. And I think a lot of people just financially are not able to retire because of how long that we're living. So it would really be nice to see the job market out there keep older workers, or where people could reinvent themselves and still have value, because everybody wants to be relevant. And you say because of less babies, Social Security is at risk.
Absolutely. And it's not just that the number of babies being born is coming down. It's also, as you know, that public opinion, as well as some politicians, have become so much more against immigration. And you see, most immigrants tend to be young. So if at the same time that we're having fewer babies, we also have less immigration, then there's going to be, so much more pressure on Social Security. And we're going to see more of population aging taking place sooner than we expected.
So do you think that will change politically how we view immigrants? I mean, we used to be very friendly. We were a country of all immigrants. We're all immigrants.
Absolutely. And I'm one of them. I came to this country more than 30 years ago, as I'm sure your listeners will be able to tell from my accent. I think it goes in waves. So as you know, here in the United States, if you consider the last century or so, we've been going through some periods during which immigrants were welcome, and very large numbers of them came. And then other periods during which immigration was restricted. So I think we're going to go through that cycle time and again.
So you're basically saying that this is cyclical. So hopefully whatever trend is going on right now, that maybe it will be viewed from your perspective, and we will see immigrants as really being necessary and helpful, not only because that's what our country is about, but due to economics.
Absolutely. I think having a rational, balanced policy for immigration that doesn't go through all of those ups and downs is probably the best for a country such as the United States, especially at a time when we're seeing so many people going into retirement or so many people who are aging. And fortunately for everyone, of course, they're going to be alive for many years to come.
Yeah.
But we need to broaden the productive base of the economy and the number of people who pay taxes, especially Social Security taxes.
I just want to end on a couple of ideas. One, you say the future is female. I'm sure many women are happy to hear that, where there'll be more female millionaires than male millionaires.
Yes, so my calculation is that probably within the next 5 to 6 years, we will see for the first time in the world as a whole, more women who are millionaires than men. And more broadly, that more than half of the wealth in the world will be owned by women for two reasons. First is your careers are becoming more attractive and more, better paid in spite of discrimination. So I'm not denying that discrimination in pay continues against women and also minorities. But also keep in mind that you live longer. And if you live longer, you have more time to accumulate money. And you also, of course, inherit money from men, right? Eventually. So all of that is essentially playing into this trend that will produce a very different world within just a few years, in which, from an economic point of view, women will be better off than men. Think about this. In American households right now, as we speak, 41% of them, the woman makes more money than the man. By the year 2030, in more than half of American households, the woman would make more money than the man.
I wonder how that's going to shift marriage, or whether people will rethink marriage. It'll be interesting to see how that affects interpersonal relationships. I was reading through an article that was talking about your book, and even though we all feel like we're going through unprecedented times, which we are, this is not the first pandemic. Pandemics have happened throughout time, and they've altered how our world has looked. What do you recommend we do to prepare for the next pandemic that happens? Because it will happen.
I think the best way to prepare for these unforeseen events, whether it's a pandemic or it's a big crisis of some other kind, is essentially to think that you need to be prepared for it, for sure. But more importantly, that when you're in the midst of it, you shouldn't be making any radical decisions, especially those that are irreversible. So this is what I discuss in the closing pages of the book. I mean, the last thing that you should do in a situation such as this, so this is the month of early September 2020, we're in the middle of a pandemic, is either to freeze, that's one extreme, and not make any decisions, or to change everything that you do, right? From top to bottom, inside out. What you need to do is to make decisions more incrementally, trying to adapt to the situation. And by all means, don't make any decision that is irreversible. Because if you're making an irreversible decision, if things change tomorrow or next week or the month after, then you're going to be in a bind.
And that's exactly the recommendation a therapist would make, which I am. Just don't make any rash decisions until you're more centered and things are more clear cut. Thank you so much for joining Talking Live. I cannot recommend this book enough. It is fantastic. And you're a brilliant man, but yet you write for the layperson. 2030, we're going to have a link up so everybody can check it out. Your pleasure. Stay in contact with me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Oh, and best of luck with your book.
Thank you.